this is Mike for Working Class Thoughts. So, today's episode is going to be on the Bloody Benders. And what makes this particular case interesting is there's a horror movie connection. So if you're a horror movie fan, it's going to be really interesting, which is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is actually based on this family of killers. Also, I want to point out something else. The area where this case is actually from, where it took place at, is in Indapendence, Kansas. I'm going to throw that out there real quick. So it was 1870 that 5 families who consider themselves spiritualists actually established a homestead area around the township of Osage in northwestern Lubbock County. Now, it was around 7 miles northwest of where Cherryville would be established only 7 months later. Now, one of the families was John Bender Sr. and John Bender Jr. They actually registered 100 acres of land adjacent to the Osage Trail, which back then was only an open road and was used to only travel west. Once they managed to build a log cabin and a barn was built, and this happened around the fall of 1871. That's when Elvira Bender and her daughter Kate actually arrived. Now, the cabin was divided into 2 rooms by a canvas wagon cover. The Benders actually used the smallest room at the rear of the living section. The front was actually converted into a general store where they actually decided to sell a few dry goods. Now, the front section also contained a kitchen, a dining table, and travelers would stop by for a meal, and some would actually stay the night, and some would not. So Elvira and Kate, they actually planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and an apple orchard north of the cabin. Now, John Bender Sr., he was around 60 years old, and he spoke very little English. He was known as someone who, when he did try to speak it, it would just come out like where it would make no sense whatsoever. Now, Elvira Bender, she also spoke very little English, and she was roughly around 55 years old. She was so unfriendly, though, that all the neighbors would actually call her a she-devil. Now, John Bender Jr., he was roughly around 25 years old, and he had auburn hair, and he also had a mustache. He spoke English fluently, fairly well. But when he did speak it, it came out with a really strong German accent. Now, John Jr. was prone to laughing kind of just aimlessly, crazily. And this led most people to actually consider him mentally challenged. Now, Kate Bender, she was around 23 years old, and she was actually very cultured in the American language. And she spoke English very well, and when she did it with no accent. Now, Kate was also a self-proclaimed healer and a psychic, and she would actually distribute flyers advertising her powers and her abilities to cure illnesses and ailments. So she also conducted seances and gave lectures on spiritualism, for which she gained a huge reputation for her constant promoting of free love. Now again, this is really crazy because of the time period. I mean, this is in the 1800s, and she's promoting free love. So think about that. Anyways, so it was Kate that actually attracted people to the Benders Inn in the first place. Although the oldest Benders, they would avoid people and they would keep to themselves. Kate and her brothers, they would they would mingle within the town. They would actually attend Sunday school in nearby Harmony Grove. And it was widely believed that the Benders were German immigrants, there is no official documentation or proof of their relationship to one another whatsoever. So, or where they actually come from. Nothing official anyways. So John Bender Sr., He was either from Germany or the Netherlands. Nobody can say for sure. And he is thought to be born John Flickinger. And according to papers, Elvira was born Elmira Hill Mark in the Adirondack Mountains. Adirondacks Mountains. She actually married Simon Mark, which she actually claimed to have 12 children with. Now later, she married William Stephen Griffin. Ain't that something? Now, Elvira was suspected of killing several of her husbands. So she was somewhat of a black widow, if you would. Now, however, nothing was actually ever proven, so nothing could stick to her. Now, Kate was actually believed to be Elvira's 5th daughter. Now, some neighbors actually claimed John Jr. and Kate were actually not brother and sister, that they were actually husband and wife. So now let's start looking into the crimes a little bit. So May of 1871, the body of a man named Jones had his skull crushed and his throat cut. Now, he was discovered in Drum Creek. The owner of Drum Creek was suspected. However, no official action was ever taken to him. Now, February of 1872, 2 dead men were actually found who had the exact same injuries as Jones. Now, by 1873, reports of missing people became so common, travelers began to stop using the Osage Trail altogether. You know, they were just like, forget it. I'm out. I ain't even trying to deal with it all. So, even before the murders, that road was actually known for horse thieves and vigilante committees. And they often arrested some for disappearances. And it would often be released later because there was no official evidence on them. They were just like, you got to go. We got to let them go. So, in fact, this is how many honest men were ran out of their own counties by these actual vigilante committees, you know. So the winter of 1872, George Newton Longer and his infant daughter, Mary Ann, they actually left Indapendence, Kansas to resettle in Iowa. And they were actually never seen again after that. So spring of 1873, Longer's former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, went looking for them and questioned homesteaders along the Osage Trail. So he just basically went looking for them, and he questioned everybody on the trail that he saw, and then he went directly to the place. So Dr. York actually reached Fort Scott on March 9th, and he began his return journey to Independence. But you know what? He never arrived home. Go figure. He never made it. So Dr. York, he actually had 2 brothers. Hold on a minute. Hurry up. So, anyways, he had 2 brothers. Colonel Ed York, living in Fort Scott, and Alexander M. York, who was a member of the Kansas State Senate and from Independence himself. So, who on November 1872, he had been instrumental in exposing U.S. Senator Samuel C. Pomeroy for bribery in state legislation. So, they both knew of William's disappearances, and they both began an all-out search. So March 28th of 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender's Inn himself, and he was with Mr. Johnson, and he explained that his brother went missing, and we're just trying to find him, he said. They admitted, hey, Dr. York did stay with us. However, it is possible that he ran into trouble with the Osage Indians. And you know what? Colonel York was like, you know what? That is possible. That could happen. So he decided to stay for dinner. April 3rd, however, Colonel York, he did return to the inn, only this time he returned with armed men. And this happened after they learned of a local woman was threatened by Elvira with knives. The young Benders, however, at this point, they flat out denied this claim. They said that their mother would never do such a thing. So when York repeated the claim, Elvira just went mad. She went flat out crazy. And she said that the woman was a witch and that she cursed her coffee and that she ordered the men to leave her house. Now this is interesting because this revealed for the very first time that Elvira's usage of the English language was way better than the family actually left on, as well as her intelligence level. So that's very, very important to actually keep in mind here. So before York left, Kate asked him to return alone, and she would use her abilities to find his brother. And York's men, they were convinced that the Benders and the other family, the Roaches. Now, before I say any more, let me just say I find this really interesting because there's a guy I went to high school with, and his last name was actually Roach, and he is the first and only person I've ever met with the last name Roach. But anyways, we're going to move on. But they were convinced that the Benders and the Roaches were guilty, and they said, hey man, they're guilty, let's forget the court, let's just drag them outside and we'll hang them all. We'll do it right now, they said. But York insisted, we can't do that. We can't kill them in cold evidence. We have to have evidence. We can't kill them in cold blood, he said. Sorry about that. So, it must be found, he said. So around that time, neighboring committees began saying that the Osage community was responsible for the disappearances. So a meeting was arranged at Harmons Grove Schoolhouse. Now, this was actually attended by 75 locals, including Colonel York himself and John Bender Jr. and John Bender Sr. Did you hear what I just said? So it was agreed during this meeting that a search party would be attained for every single homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drunk Creek. And this was despite York's suspicion of the Benders. Nobody kept an eye on their house or the Bender family or the Roaches whatsoever. So nobody noticed when the Benders' property was abandoned and the animals looked unfed. But one guy, he did. His name was Billy Toll, and he was driving cattle past the Bender's property, and then he noticed it. He said the house was abandoned, the animals looked starved to death, so Toll did what any guy would have in that situation for that time period. He reported it. However, because of the bad weather at the time, it took several days before anybody could ever arrive to help investigate. Now, when a search party did arrive, however, they found the cabin completely empty and a bad odor was noticed. Now, they traced it to a trap door under a bed and it was nailed shut. Hold on 1 minute again, please. So, when they opened it, they found an empty room under the bed, and they found it to have clotted blood all over the floor. So, the stone slab floor had to be broken up with sledgehammers. No bodies were found in it, or was determined to be in it. However, it was determined that the smell was actually from blood-soaked soil. The men physically lifted the cabin, moved it to the side so that they could dig, but no bodies were ever found. Alright, hold on 1 minute again, okay? So they began to probe the ground around the cabin with the metal rods, especially the soil of the vegetable garden and the orchard. Now, Dr. York's body was discovered later on that evening, buried face down with his feet below the surface. Now, this actually lasted until around midnight. A suspected gravesite marked before the men were satisfied that they actually found them all. So you got to understand that, this is crazy. These people were they wanted to find these people that were killed. And they just kept digging as long as they could, all the way into midnight. But the digging actually resumed the next morning, and 8 bodies were found, 7 of the 9 suspected graves, while 1 was found in a well, along with numerous other body parts. All but 1 had their heads bashed in with a hammer and throats cut, with the bodies being completely and utterly mutilated. The body of a young girl was found with no injuries significant or cause of death. Now, it is believed she was actually choked and then buried alive. Now, Kansas newspapers at the time, they actually said people were so mad at finding the bodies that a friend of the Benders named Brockman was actually hung from a beam inside the Benders Inn. Now, this lasted until he passed out, and then they actually brought him back to life, and they questioned him about what he knew about the Benders and where they went to. And then they would hang him again, and then they would revive him, and then they would ask him more questions, and then they would hang him again. They did this a total of 3 times, and they released him. He staggered home, as one was actually drunken and deranged. Now, I want to point out the reason why this is. Whenever you're choked and you're revived, if you've ever been strangled at all, to the point to where you pass out, and then you come back, you have a moment to where you don't have clarity. It's like you're drunk. Everything will look like wavy, kind of like you're drunk. And that's what they're saying. So the fact that this happened to him a total of 3 times in a row, and he let him go, he was walking kind of aimlessly and drunk back home. Almost deranged like. So a Roman Catholic prayer book was actually found in the house with notes that were written in German, which were actually translated to read, Jonathan Bender, born when he came to America July 1st, 18 ? Meaning that they didn't have that part. The big slaughter day, June 8th, will departed, is what it said. So whenever a guest would actually stay at the Bender's Inn, the host would give the guest a seat of honor at the table, which was happened to be positioned over a trap door that led into the cellar. The victim's back would be placed to a curtain, and Kate would actually distract the guest with the seance reading, while John Bender Sr. and John Bender Jr. would come from behind the curtain and strike the guest on the right side of the head of the skull with a hammer, right to the temple. And the victim's throat would then be cut by John Bender Jr. to make sure that they were dead. And then the body would be dropped to the trap door. And once in the cellar, the body would be stripped and later buried somewhere else on the property. Often they would choose the apple orchard or the vegetable garden and apple orchard. Although some of the victims have been very wealthy, often others carry very little value on them whatsoever. And the popular conclusion is that the Bender family actually killed just for the sheer thrill of it. They just like doing it. So eventually, testimony from the people who stayed at the Bender's Inn, who actually managed to escape before being killed, they actually reappeared to support the presumed execution method of the Benders. William Pinkerton said that he refused to sit near that wagon clock because of the stains on it. He said the stains, the smell was just horrible, and I did not want to sit by it. So he was threatened by Kate herself with a knife, and then he fled the house. A Catholic priest said that he saw one of the Bender men concealing a large hammer, at which point he decided to leave because he felt unsafe. Now, two men who had been traveling to the inn to experience Kate's psychic abilities for themselves. They stayed for dinner, but they actually refused to sit at the table next to that horrible stained cloth, they said. Instead, they chose to eat their meal at the counter. Kate became very abusive towards them at that point. A short while later, two Bender men emerged from behind the curtain. They said that they felt uncomfortable, and they left. So more than a dozen bullet holes were actually found in the Bender's roof and the sides of the cabin. And this led people to say that some of the victims, they must have tried to fight back. So the detectives following wagon tracks discovered that the Bender's wagon was abandoned and with starving teams of horses, with one was actually dead just outside of the city limits. Of their 12, hold on a second, of only 12 miles north of the inn. It was confirmed that the family had bought tickets to Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad for Humboldt. At Chanute, John Jr. and Kate left the train and they caught the MK&T train south to the terminus in the River County of Denison, Texas. From there, they traveled out to an outlaw camp border of the Texas of New Mexico. No one actually pursued Kate and John John Bender Jr. because it was just assumed that they would just die or the other outlaws would kill them themselves. Because often, if you were a law enforcement and you pursued anybody in that area, no detective really ever came back. So later, it is said that the person pursuing them actually traced the pair to the border where he found John Jr. He had died from apoplexy. So John Sr. and Elvira Bender, they did not leave the station. They actually continued north to Kansas City, where it is believed that they bought tickets to St. Louis, Missouri. Several groups of vigilantes in that area formed to search for the Benders. Many stories said that one group actually caught them and shot them all on sight. But, however, they left Kate, for whom they buried alive, for revenge of the girl that they buried alive. Another group claimed that they caught the Benders and they lynched them before throwing their bodies into the Vitagras River. Yet another claimed to have killed the Benders during a gunfight and buried their bodies on the prairie. And no one claimed the $3,000 reward, however, because no one had evidence of their death. However, the story of the Benders' escape spree and the search continued. And this happened off and on for the next 50 years. So often, two women who would be traveling alone together would be stopped by vigilante committees or law enforcement, and they would be accused of being Kate and her mother. That's just how desperate people were to catch the killers. So, in 1884, it was reported that John Sr. actually committed suicide in Lake Michigan. Also in 1884, an elderly man matching John Sr.'s description was arrested in Montana for a murder involving a hammer. Go figure. A request for a positive ID was sent to Terryville, but the suspect severed his foot trying to escape the leg irons, and he actually bled out to death in a jail cell. By the time deputies arrived in Cherryville, the body was so decomposed that it was impossible to ID. So the man's skull from that jail cell was actually displayed as John Sr.'s head at the saloon until Prohibition forced its closure in 1920, and then the skull just vanished. So several weeks after the discovery of the bodies, Addison Roach and his son-in-law, William Buxton, was arrested as accessories to the murders. In total, 12 men of bad reputation and general were accused, including Brockman. All that had been involved in disposing of the victims and selling of the stolen goods, with Mitt Cherry, a member of the Vigilante Committee, implicated for forging a letter from one of the victims himself, informing the victim's wife that he had arrived safely at his destination in Illinois. Brockman would be arrested again 23 years later for the rape of his own 18-year-old daughter. What a sick bastard, right? On October 31st, 1809, it was reported that Miss Elmira Monroe and Miss Sarah Eliza Davis had been arrested in Niles, Michigan, several weeks earlier for larceny. They were also found not guilty, but immediately arrested for the Bender murders. So they were let go, and then as they were leaving, they were actually re-arrested for the Bender murders. The daughter of one of the victims, Miss Frances E. McCain, also had reported the pair to the authorities in early October after tracking them down herself. Her story was she had visions from dreams, and she discussed this with Sarah Eliza. Oh no, I didn't think of this before. Anyways. So, the woman's ID was confirmed by a photograph. In the mid-October, Deputy Sheriff Leroy Dick, the Osage Township trustee who had headed the search of the Bender's property, arrived in Michigan and arrested the couple on October 30th following their release on larceny charges. Miss Monroe resisted, saying that she would rather be taken alive, but was taken by local deputies. Miss Davis claimed that Miss Monroe was Eliza Bender herself, but she was not Kate, but her sister Sarah. She later signed an affidavit to a total effect of Monroe continued to deny the identification and turned to Sarah Eliza. Being the real Kate Bender. Now, Deputy Sheriff Dick, along with Miss McCain, escorted the two to Oswego, Kansas, where 7 members of the 13th panel confirmed the identification and moved to trial. Now, another of Miss Monroe's daughters, Mary Gerdie, later provided an affidavit claiming that her name was Elmira Shearer under the name of Elmira Marks, and was serving a 2-year sentence in Detroit in a House of Corrections in 1872 for the manslaughter of her daughter-in-law, Emily Mark. Now, records showed it to be true. Now, after her hearing, Miss Monroe denied any knowledge or share of the manslaughter charge and remained locked up within her daughter. Now, originally scheduled on February in 1890, the trial was held over until May. Miss Monroe now admitted she had married a Mr. Shearer in 1872 and claimed she had previously denied it, as she did not want the court to know that her name was Shearer. and at the time that she had a conviction for manslaughter. Now, their attorney provided a marriage certification showing that she was in Michigan at the time of the murders. The judge found both women to be innocent, and the affidavits and the court papers from the county make it almost impossible to get any information because everything is missing. So I wanted to point that out. Hold on 1 minute, guys. Oh. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. Anyway, so I just wanted to point that out, that, they literally said that there was not enough evidence to support any of these claims. Just now you heard that. And they had to be, they couldn't be charged with that because the person. All right, so I want to keep you guys to keep that in mind, that the people that they thought was her, that they had locked up, there was evidence showing that she lived in a completely different area at the time. So it was impossible for her because she was locked up in Michigan at the time of the murder. So there was, there's actual evidence of that. So I want you guys to keep that in mind about this case. So with this case, you have a lot of interesting aspects because you have a family. So, all right, so some important takeaways from this case that I want to address, such as, one, we did establish the fact that there's a lot of small town gossip, as we often do in these true crime episodes that I'm looking at, especially in smaller communities. It's a lot of hearsay, she say. Now, in this particular case, the Bender family and the Roach family are guilty for what they did. They did find the bodies that were buried. They did manage to prove that, or at least prove to their liking, that the Roaches actually helped them get rid of the bodies. I also want you to keep in mind that not only was this the very first American family serial killers, this will bring me into a new thing of a new dynamic of killer. This is the very first time in American history that a quote-unquote family got together and killed together. But not only did they kill together, they also included their neighbors to help them kill as well, or to more or less to get rid of the evidence. So really this case has an interesting center the whole way around. The other thing I want to point out is this is the 1800s. And Kate was running around talking about how she is all about free love in a state like Kansas. I'm about free love. I don't like commitment, she said. She's also considered herself a witch and a psychic as well. This is the reason why earlier in this episode why I said that I find that very intriguing is because in the 1800s, even in America, even in the Old West time period, there were some a lot of diehard Christians that would have just shot you dead right there in the middle of the street. Be perfectly honest. Especially in areas like that. So I am very surprised that she gained notoriety or gained fame from it. And I'm very surprised that she managed to get away with doing what she did. I also want to point out that there is a lot of speculation among the fact that are they really a family, or is it just an older guy who got together with one of his buddies that were younger, and they came to America, and then they moved the guy's wife and the other guy's wife, and then they posed as a mother, father, son, and daughter duo. Because we do have that into the equation. We could easily throw that dice into the thing, because you have that right there. Bam, you have a conspiracy theory. Are they really family or are they not? Nobody knows. The other thing I want to point out is they got away with it. That's the other important takeaway. Okay. They really got away with it because the guy that they were referring to in the research material, now they are pretty positive that it is Bender Sr. However, like the research material states, the body was so decomposed that it was unrecognizable, meaning that they could not determine with 100% accuracy or even a 50% accuracy, or probably much less than that it is actually him, which means there is still a high probability rate that any one of those other supposed sightings of John Bender Sr. could have very well been him. Because Nobody could determine that that was the actual person. Now, we're going to move on. Now we have the lady that went to court. She said it was proven. Her attorney said, here's the marital creed paperwork right here, the marriage license. Here's her arrest that she was serving time in this state at this time. So there's no way possible that it could have been her. So bam, right there. That means that lady is still out there somewhere. Well, she's not anymore, but at that time she was out there. Now you have Junior. Now Junior's been spotted off and on. Now there's been rumors that he died, but however, it's never been solidly proven that he actually did. Neither did Kate. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. They just kind of just vanished. They did all these murders and they just went and just vanished. So I find that very, very intriguing. I also want to point out something else. We're talking about the Old West in a sense that a lot of people don't understand it. Now, when you're watching this, if you're watching this overseas, more than likely, whenever you hear the words Old West, you think of Billy the Kid, you think of, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Cowboys and Indians, John Wayne, that's probably what you're thinking of. But what you're failing to realize is, in American history, there is an area of the Old West that was the prairies. It was the land grab sections. It was Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri a little bit, Texas. It was like land runs all over the place, and that was up in this area over here, and that's where this family happened to be at. Now, I also want to point out something else, that the family was also known to be kind of freakish. You already have one person that was accused of being mentally challenged because he couldn't hold back the fact that he couldn't laugh. Now, I do want to point out that there is a little bit of a fact there that in psychology states that when some people get nervous, not all, but when some people get nervous, they laugh. Now, if he was nervous because he knew that the person might have a hard time understanding what he's saying, he might laugh as a defense mechanism. That's a psychological fact. And it's something that is very, very hard for most people to be able to control. That's just a fact, okay? A lot of people, they just simply cannot control that. You know what I'm saying? They just can't. It's just simple as that, man. Now, we're going to move on a little bit more farther, right? A little bit more farther. So, the other thing is one of the members of the Roach family was also, and I didn't include this in the research material because I wanted to do it right now. One of the members of the Roach family actually had horrid-looking feet and supposedly was rumored to be a circus freak at one time. So now we can move into a different aspect. I don't know if you know, but a while back I did an episode on the Romani and Gypsy culture. Now, a lot of Romani and Gypsy people, the first ones that migrate over here, some of them managed to make it into those type of camps. So, they very well could have been that area too. Now, however, there is a strong... Now, remember, nobody said if they know they're German or from the Netherlands, right? Well, think about that for a second. What kind of accent do you have around that area of Europe? You have a very common dialect accent. Granted, the German accent is very, very unique. I would actually argue the fact that the accent from Netherlands is actually pretty unique in itself too. So both accents that the guy's being accused of possibly being from is actually very unique and hard to determine basis on the fact of just how his voice tone is. So I do want to throw that out there as well. So we have all of these different factors in play here, and you got to keep this in mind. So that is the reason why the Bender family is one of my favorite serial killer subjects to look at, mainly because of the fact that they are the very first American family serial killers, which actually brought forth, without them knowing it, or anybody in that time period, because it didn't take place till later on. However, it did bring them into a whole new perceptive type of profiling, which is the family dynamic spree. Anyways, so the family dynamics spree, meaning that it's only recent. I would say it's only in the past century that the FBI's even brought in the aspect of family killers. And it's not very common. A whole family that kills together, this is not a very common thing, so it's very unique. Off the top of my head, I could only think of about 4 or 5 different cases just right off the bat. Now, I know there's a great number of them globally. I'm just saying, off the top of my head, I can only think of 4. So it is a very unique type of demographic when you're looking at true crime. So that's another reason why they're in that list, or in that bracket, I should say, with me. The other reason why they're in the bracket is because they're unique. They're unique in their personalities. They're unique in their personalities in that time era, and they actually got away with it. They got away with it. That's the other reason why. No matter how relentless people were, and they had search parties out from Kansas to Oklahoma to Texas to Missouri to Arkansas to New Mexico, and nobody was able to find them at all, anywhere. They even had search parties as far out as Minnesota or whatever. So they got away with it. They got away with it. Now I do want you to keep in mind that the Benders are not their real name. Now, Senior's real name was, what was it? Fitz something. I said it earlier in the episode, but if you go back and re-listen to it, that was his real name. Miss Bender's real name is I also said her real name as well earlier in this episode. So the Benders are not actually their real name. The Benders was a real family, though, that was already dead. So these people just assumed these people's identity, basically. Now, I'm willing to bet that they probably killed the family and took their identity. If I was to argue, you're talking about the 1800s. It's not like nowadays where they have Facebook and they have all that. They could have easily done it, got away with it, took their identities, and moved about the way. So, and I want to say that because here pretty soon we're going to have another true crime episode where there is a killer that did just that. It was a time period without technology. It was a time period before people could just Google something. It was a time period before they could even pick up a telephone. And it was very common back then for people to do that. They would, especially for what I would call the first serial killers in history. It wasn't uncommon for them to do that. They would just wipe out somebody and assume their identity. You know what I'm saying? And just keep it moving so they can basically get away with it and freely travel. So we're going to be looking into all kinds of things. Earlier, when I did my special announcement, I said 2020 was going to be a different type of year for Working Class Thoughts as far as the show goes, and it will be. Like, you guys just got a little hint. I just dropped a little Easter egg just about a couple seconds ago. We're going to be looking into a lot of different aspects of true crime this whole year. And it's going to be hit and miss. Like I said earlier in that preview episode, I don't even know if I'm going to fully announce stuff before I do it. It's just going to be hit and miss and kind of surprise here and there. But we're going to be looking at true crime, and we're going to be doing episodes like this where I'm going to be looking at the actual person or the groups of people. I'm also going to be doing some other type of things within true crime as well. So you guys have a lot to look forward to that. So without further ado, this is Mike for Working Class Thoughts. This is actually the conclusion, the final thoughts part. I'm going to add this into what I already have. And hopefully, I can get this episode uploaded by tomorrow. At least that's what I'm hoping. So everybody, have a good night. This is Mike for Working Class Thoughts. Peace, love, and good vibes as always. And everybody have a good night. All right? All right.